Today on the show, I interview the world's only consulting detective apologist, aka J. Warner Wallace. It's always a lot of fun to have Detective Wallace on the show. He's a great conversationist, really fun to have on. I always enjoy talking to him. We had a great conversation today about his latest book that he co-authored with Sean McDowell, who we've also had on the show before. And the title of that book is called So the Next Generation Will Know. And it's all about, as he says in the episode, there's plenty of apologetic books about why to believe in Christianity and why apologetics. But this book is particularly about how to pass this information on to the next generation. It's really a how to do apologetics in a way that informs the next generation. I think you'll enjoy it. If you want to watch or listen to the bonus segment, 5 more minutes with J. Warner Wallace, follow the link in the description below over to our Patreon page and become a supporter. And you can listen to us talk about detective stuff. Actually, some really interesting things in there. As always, it's good to hear from J. Warner Wallace. If you enjoy the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and hope you enjoy the episode. Well, hello and welcome to Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and today I am excited to introduce my special guest to you. He is our first repeat interviewee on the podcast. We are so thankful to have back on the world's only consulting detective apologist, J. Warner Wallace. How are you, sir?
Doing good. I guess that's probably true. I was at next week is Law Enforcement Appreciation Week.
Oh, yeah.
It happens every year in May. And so I was at our service today we have, the fallen officers who have died in the line of service in our agency. We do a service on the week before, usually, and we have an Armed Forces Day parade then in the weekend of. So I'm there with my son today, and I realized, wow, it is probably true that he might be the next guy up who will take over that mantle for me.
Yeah.
He's already started to write blogs on our website and do podcasts on our website. So I think Jimmy's probably the next guy who will, sadly, right? Because there's a lot of Christians who are detectives and maybe who could step up and start to talk about these issues. I hope they will.
So he's stepping up and actually writing about apologetics and stuff on your side.
Yeah, he is. And
okay.
So a lot of that is just, what can you squeeze in given, his schedule is as crazy as mine was back in the day when I was doing that full time and trying to do the stuff youth pastoring, and I did all that bivocationally. So now it's his turn to try to figure out how to balance that career and your passion for apologetics. How do you put those in balance?
Yeah.
We talk about that a lot. You're doing that.
Uh-huh.
I mean, all of us who are bivocational, but tent makers, basically, tent making apologists, or I call these tent making case makers. That's really what we're doing, right? We're trying to figure out. And I think a lot of people who watch your podcast and your videos, I'll bet you that they think to themselves, I could do that, or I should do that, or maybe I'd like to try to do that. And I think that our job, if people have been there and done that, is we want to kind of help them figure out how to find that balance. It's doable. It just means you have to have appropriate, probably goals, like what can you achieve as a follower of Christ who's been called to a certain profession. And you still like to answer the call of defending and and sharing the faith. So
yeah, you definitely. I would just say, and I'm not experienced as you. You definitely have to be passionate about it. A lot of times it's been the passion for defending the faith and just this topic of apologetics that has kept me going and doing it, and I just really enjoy it, whether there's 3 people listening or whether there's any patron supporters or not. It's just something I've always enjoyed doing, and you certainly have to find that balance so that your wife doesn't get real mad at you for always being in this room on the computer.
Well, there's times when you're going to stretch that stuff so thin, right, that if you don't have somebody who feels, and I often say this to people who want to jump in any kind of ministry, if you're married, you have to decide as a couple that you want to jump into that.
You
ministry.
certainly do. Yeah, that's
If
for
only
sure.
one of you is committed to this, or you're going to have times when it's going to feel like, man, I'm spinning way too many plates.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not both committed to seeing it as a couple's ministry,
Mm-hmm.
It'll be challenging for sure.
Yeah, you definitely got to know your limits. There's certain things that I wish or I would kind of want to do, but maybe those things will come one day. I'm perfectly content doing what I'm doing now. As usual, me and you just get straight to talking and go off on some tangent. But this is great,
Yeah, right.
great having you
it.
on and having a good conversation. Detective Wallace has written a new book recently, co-authored with Sean McDowell, who we've also had on the podcast before. And the title of that book is called So That the Next Generation Will Know, Preparing Young Christians for a Challenging World. Right. And so Detective Wallace, well, first of all, I meant to say earlier, you were talking about law enforcement appreciation. I always want to say thank you for that. And I'll say it in advance of Law Enforcement Appreciation Week. I'll say it now. Thank you so much for your service, and to your son and your father as well, and everybody out there listening who has served. Thank you so much for that. We greatly appreciate that. So let's get into the book.
Okay.
Again, so the next generation will know. We're talking about the next generation and kind of passing on the gospel to them and apologetics and stuff like that. What was really the motivation for you in writing this new book?
Well, it practically speaking, a lot of it just came out of the fact that that Sean came to me. We've been dear friends for a lot of years, and we both worked with young people as part of our primary audience, right? He has been a Christian educator. My daughter was in his high school classes when he was a high school teacher.
Oh, really?
We both are on faculty at Summit. Probably half of our audiences or more are going to be young people. Certainly, that's been our goal, is to reach teenagers with the gospel, with the case for Christ. That's been a large part of what I do. I try to make everything visual, for example, for that reason. I kind of have learned, and I youth pastored for a number of years. I followed my own kids when I became a Christian. They were maybe lower elementary, so I just jumped in and started volunteering. And before long, I'm running the children's ministry for 5th and 6th graders at a huge church here in Southern California. And then as they got older, I just followed them, into ministry, and I ended up as their youth pastor for a number of years. And then I launched a church that was really built on the backs of high schoolers and college students. So this has been our passion for a lot of years. Now, Sean came to me and said, hey, we both teach at Biola in this apologetics program, and he would like, I think, and it's noble, although I'll tell you why I think it might be problematic, he wanted to launch a master's program for just youth pastors. Mm-hmm. An apologetics program that's designed for youth pastors to reach the next generation. And if that was the case, so the question is, what would the text be? What would is there something out there that we could build a master's program off of from a text perspective? And there wasn't anything. We looked, there's a lot of what books. What is true about Christianity? What is the case for God's existence? What? But there were no how-to manuals that would help us practically present this. So this is a book that is not full of whats. If you're looking for what is the case for Christianity, what is the Christian worldview articulate, that's a different set of books. We've all written those. I've got 3 of those. Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a very practical how-to. Once you know that thing about Christianity, there's still the challenge of having to present it in a unique way to a unique generation. And this generation is different. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking?
Oh, that's fine. I won't be offended. I'm 26.
Okay, so you're kind of at the end of the millennials, right? Maybe 5 years from the end of the millennials. You're kind of in the lower half of the millennials. Yeah. And Gen Z are this generation between, let's say, 3 and 20, right in that range. And so the question, and this as in your age group, my kids are your age, that for the most part you had a phone in your hand at some point by the time you were a teenager, probably.
Yeah. I think the difference really between me or what I've just noticed between me and the next generation being Gen Z. By the way, I'm a millennial. Millennials are adults now. You can stop blaming us for everything. Right. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
But the difference really is that I didn't really ever get a phone until, or any of my friends, until I was a teenager. So,
right.
My brain got to develop without it for a long time. And I think the difference really, I think the difference really is that Gen Z has always had this, social media and all that effect. They've always had
Absolutely.
it. I didn't always have it. But
Well, and that's one of the things we do an entire chapter about trying to understand this generation and their characteristics. And a lot has been written now about Gen Z over the last 2 years. And almost every list of descriptors for what's the difference between Gen Z and other generations? Almost every list begins with the fact that they are digital natives. That you can have a lot of other different descriptors that are offered in all these lists, and so we began our list that way too, because that is really imagine. In the entire history of humanity, there have been certain ages that have been defined by either technological or industrial improvements, right? And so you see these iron, the Bronze Age, the Industrial Age. We are in the Information Age. It is as pivotal and as different and as probably even more dramatically culture changing as any prior age. And we're talking about the generation that is the first complete generation born in that age. So they don't recall a time before there were smartphones, before that glowing rectangle dictated everything.
Yeah, no.
And it changes. If you think, I mean, I'm fascinated by the many ways. I'm a communicator, and I would communicate through books. Listen, I talked a lot to my friends who are in the publishing industry about how communicating ideas is changing.
Right.
Given the nature of this media. And I think it really calls us as parents. Now, here's the thing. It's interesting. So it always happens at the beginning of an age, a beginning of a cultural shift,
right,
that there will be parents from their foot in the old age who are raising kids with a foot in the new age. Now, one generation from now, that won't be the case.
Right.
But so for a lot of us, I think it is important for us as adults to figure out what's different about raising a generation, especially a generation that is completely autonomous. I want you to think about that for a second.
Yeah.
You know, they have the ability to select consumption of media in a way that was never available before. Before, if you were going to watch the news, you had one of three choices.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, you had one of three choices. That was it.
Yeah.
And these folks were pretty like-minded, so you didn't have a lot of choices. Now you can actually find the news outlet that reflects your worldview and ignore all the other. You can find the entertainment outlet that provides you with the entertainment you want and ignore all the other. So you have choices to control what you consume. Now think about that for a second. That means that young people are able for the first time ever to craft a micro narrative of their choosing and eliminate all the other noise that they choose to. And here we are as Christians saying, hey, there's a meta narrative, God's story, which is overarching and transcendent, to a generation that has been raised developing their micro-narratives.
Right.
I think it's going to be the hardest. And also, what is our meta-narrative? It begins with you submitting your autonomy.
Right.
In a culture that has been raised to maximize its autonomy, I think it is going to change the way we communicate the gospel.
Okay. So let's dive into kind of this uniqueness of this generation, and you've been talking about that. So what does this mean for Christian educators, or, I mean, we could take a few different categories here, whether Christian parents or Christian educators or youth ministers seem to be a targeted audience. How should they go about, or how does this uniqueness of the generation affect, or how should it affect them and their approach to whether just doing ministry or raising up Christian children in the home?
Yeah, and when Sean first came to me with this idea, I said to him, so you want to write a book that helps youth pastors teach apologetics. You realize that has an audience of about 10 people, right? I mean, you realize that's not a very big audience, because I don't think it's hard for us even to convince youth pastors sometimes that this is an important field of study, to be able to teach Christian worldview.
Yeah, well, it may not even be that. It may be something else that I think you touch on in the book, which is you're going to have a hard time convincing them, not that it is important, but that it's actually worth their time, or that it's actually like effective in bringing in, numbers or something like that. But I don't want to attribute any motive, but.
Yeah, exactly. And so I said, we need to be broader in our audience. And I think really the responsibility I felt as a parent was that discipling of my kids, spiritual discipling, was not something I wanted to give to a youth pastor anyway. I knew that was my responsibility. Right. And I think as parents, now that's the audience I'm really now we've provided in each chapter breakout sections for what parents, how they can interpret this data, how they can actually apply this, what they can do with their own kids, how youth pastors can do it, and how Christian educators can do it. But I think what's changing for us, right, is this sense that we sometimes when we make a case for Christianity as apologists, I hate that word, but as Christian case makers, we know that there are certain factual claims that we want to communicate, and so we camp in the home of truth. It's about professing truth and about making claims that are truth claims and backing those up. But we know that especially now, in a digital age where we have so much information, that one of the things we see right away with the digital natives is they are excellent researchers. And they have access to all this information immediately. There are times when you can be doing a talk publicly, and you will see that people are already fact-checking.
I was going to say, you're getting fact-checked right on the spot, yeah.
Yeah, right on the spot and live in real time. And that's something that's very, very new, right? Now, we've also noticed, though, is that even though, yes, you have more access to information, but we see a decrease in trust of that information. So what we see is a group that is growing up with far more access to other angles and other pieces of information, yet far less trusting of any one source for information. Well, how do you trust? Everything looks about the same online. I mean, you've seen this, right?
Right.
Sometimes a YouTube channel can look incredibly professional from somebody who's got one camera, no staff, no background in the field necessarily. So how do you know who to trust? So now I think more than ever, the important connection between influence, relationship, and truth. So if you want to influence somebody with truth claims now, it's this connection between relationship and truth. Now, we've always known that's the case. But now, I think our chapter starts with what does love look like in this context? What does relationship look like in this context? Because look, people can listen to our talk today, and they may not have a personal relationship with you or me, and it'll have some impact. But I guarantee you, if you had an authoritative source for the information who has a relationship with you that is deep and robust and trusting, you're going to have far more impact on that claim. That's why we tell parents all the time, you can't tell your kids, hey, look, I don't have an answer for that, but here's a book. Here's a book that you can read. Right. Okay, well, mom or dad, remember, that person who wrote that book has no relationship with your son or daughter. Better for you to read this book and consume that information and become the expert for your kids, because then you, if you're properly researched, have the perfect combination of relationship and truth. And so that means that's the bad news is that takes work. Right. And if you're a youth pastor, this is why, I came from a church that was a mega church. But as I got to the point where I was pastoring youth, I think we had over 500 students in 5th and 6th grade when I was doing upper elementary. Yeah. That's a lot of students. Yeah. I could not know them all personally. When I got to youth pastoring, I said, I want to have a group that's small enough that I can develop the relationship with each person to know them personally. Because I knew that combination of relationship and truth, I needed to maximize those. And it's two sides of the same coin.
Well, you actually, you find this you find an example of this in Jesus, do you not?
Oh, of course, right? Yeah. Now, look, there's the masses. Right? There's the 72 that were sent. Yeah. There is the 12. There are the 3. So there are kind of concentric circles of influence, right? But you're going to have a lot more influence with the 3 than you even are with the 12. Right. Than you even are with the 72. So I think that there's definitely good examples of this, and we are wired. Look, one of the reasons why I think we are wired this way is because we are in the image of a triune God that is an eternal community. So these relationships are something that our God, Yahweh, knows about. If our description of him being triune is true, then we know he is not learning how to navigate relationships as he's creating us. Instead, he's been in an eternal relationship, and he's always been about this relationship. So I think that's part of why it works so well for us. But again, what we wanted to do is say, okay, all that being true, what are the kind of practical outcomes of this? A generation that, number one, is digital natives. 2, they are incredible fact checkers. They are researchers based on that digital. They are also multitaskers to a level you've never seen in any other generation.
Probably to an unsafe way.
Yeah, probably, right? That's why we always say, hey, you shouldn't text and drive. That kind of well, of course it is dangerous. Yeah. But can you imagine to a group that is always multitasking, this just seems like another aspect of multitasking. They don't even see the danger in any of that kind of stuff because they're constantly flipping between sites, doing their social media while they're watching something on streaming media. Yeah. They're constantly involved in. And I know my mom is in her 70s, so she's in a generation before me, and she doesn't understand the multitasking nature of her own grandkids. I get it.
Well, you would have to, just for example, I had to send you an email. while I was at work saying I'm going to be a few minutes late. I mean,
Right.
used to, it would be, oh, we made these plans and now I'm going to be late. Sorry, Jim. I couldn't let you know if I didn't have a phone or
Yeah.
stuff like that. Now I
Right.
do. So now I can actually multitask. So I'm still at work and sending you an email. You know what I mean? Like technology plays into that as well.
Oh no, it
And so your
does.
mother comes from a generation where
That's right.
it just wasn't an option to
It wasn't
multitask in
an
that way.
option. Well, I think what this has done also for this generation is to increase their impatience, right?
For
Because
sure.
what this allows, we have a certain sense of immediacy
Mm-hmm.
in our technology right now that shortens our. Now, much has been said about shortening attention spans. I think that we have to be careful about. First of all, I never see these as negatives. One of the things that Sean and I did when we did this, Sean's done talks in the past where he's asked people to give him descriptions of what they would say about Gen Z. And it's amazing that when you ask people, just give me your idea of give me some descriptions of Gen Z, they're almost always negative. I actually think that all these things are exciting.
Oh, for
And
sure.
I see them as very positive. I think they are things that we just have to learn to speak new languages, right? That's always been the case. Every
Right.
generation of old people, at some point, I have to kind of guard against this. I'm now 57. And if you're not careful, you can fall into that kind of old man attitude. It's like, hey, get off my lawn kind of an
Yeah.
attitude, right? But instead, what we have to do is embrace these as challenges. And to be young at heart often just means to stay up on what the language changes are, not in terms of words.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the way we speak to each. So, for example, when I first started my own ministry 10 years ago, I think it was almost entirely a blog-driven ministry. And now I'm just shifting away from, I used to do 5 blogs a week. I used to do a daily blog. Okay. Okay. Who's reading daily blogs?
Well,
I guess people my age. I don't know, but I know I had to shift.
yeah.
So now we do 2 blogs, which I think is still probably too many.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 1 blog a week is enough. And we're doing 2 videos and 1 audio podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're moving communication in a direction. And I think what makes and the way in which Gen Z are impatient, I think they're just visually impatient. I don't think they are content impatient. They're still going to go to the new Marvel movie. How long is that thing? It's like 3 hours, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to sit through the entire thing. But there will be thousands of visual scene changes in that 3-hour movie. I bet you if you were to take Gone with the Wind and count the scene changes,
Right.
camera angles, count the shifts, the corners that are turned visually, and compare them to the corners we turn now, you're going to go, wow, it's not no comparison.
Right.
We've grown impatient in terms of turning corners. That's actually changed the way I communicate on the stage when I'm working with younger groups. I just know I have to be visual,
Mm-hmm.
and I have to turn as many corners as I can.
Yeah, I was gonna say all of this is certainly true and almost intuitive when once you say it, it's like, oh yes, that's definitely true. Now it's almost as if time is speeding up. I think I've heard those words before from somewhere. But
Yeah,
so I was
yeah.
gonna ask how this actually affects doing ministry with the next generation or raising up Christians in the next generation specifically. How does this maybe lack of attention span, maybe, or even the fact that they can multitask so well, how does that affect how we do things?
Well, I think what it does is we always in the book we talk about things that are timeless and things that are timely.
Mm-hmm.
And the timeless things are just the things that are grounded in human nature because we're designed in the image of God. Those things don't change. The expression of those things might change, and those are the timely things we have to kind of stay up with. But I think the desire for community, the desire for relationship is never going to change because that's the kind of we are those kinds of beings. And that's why I think we can, as teachers who are older, I think the first thing we have to be committed to is the development of strong relationships that are genuine. Because I think in a world in which there's a lot of talking head shows like what we're doing right now, what is so valuable for anyone is a sense of being really genuine and transparent. And I think actually that's why I do a lot of these kinds of talking head videos without a lot of post production, without a lot of bells and whistles. I think in the end, I want it to feel more like you're sitting right next to me in a relationship with me at coffee and having a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for most of us, we need to shift toward. There's one thing I talk about in the book that I think is incredibly important to a generation that is bombarded with information. I remember when I first, I don't think I've got on my bookshelf back there somewhere. When I first wrote the first book, Cold Case Christianity, about a year before, Michael Hyatt wrote a book called Platform, Getting Heard in a Noisy World. And it was just about how authors need to build a social media platform. Mm-hmm. The subtitle is so true for what's happening with our generation right now. How do we get heard in a world where there's so much information out there and so much noise?
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you one thing that will be helpful. This is a tip that I want to offer, very practical tips. And I talk about this as being too wise for every what. Mm-hmm. And this is what I would say. I would say that if you're a parent or a youth pastor or a Christian educator, we have a tendency to do a lot of what. Here's what is true about the nature of God. Here's what is true about the gospel. Here is what the gospel is. Here is what is true about the nature of Jesus, what Jesus did. Here's what we're describing, making claims. But we don't always provide the two whys that I think this generation seeks, only because every other worldview is trying to provide those two whys. And the first why is, okay, on the basis of what evidence is that? Why do you believe that's true? Mm-hmm. Okay, you're making this claim about God, or about Christianity, about Jesus, whatever, about history, about politics, whatever it may be. Give me some data. Give me some reason why I should embrace that. Because remember, your claim is just out there hanging in space with all the other claims. And those folks over there think that their view, especially if they're not Christians, they think that their view is grounded in the facts of science, mm-hmm. evidentially grounded. They think that all of our claims as Christians are just blind faith claims. And so to compete with those kinds of ideas, I simply want to provide my students with good reason to believe this is true. And that means I want to use everything available to me. I will sometimes make that case strictly from Scripture, but I'll probably also use philosophical, historical, scientific, all kinds of other forms of evidence to substantiate my claims mm-hmm. to Christians.
Yeah, there does seem to be and I've actually kind of said this for a while now, but I think it's probably just because I intuit this as I am one of these young people. I'm in the millennial generation. But there does seem to be a desire for authenticity, if I could put it in a word. Don't just, again, it relates to apologetics in the sense that you just said, okay, that's what you believe. Tell me why you actually believe it. How can I actually know that it's true? This desire for authenticity is what I've always said. You're not gonna fill the pews with millennials or with Gen Z with big flashy show or whatever. It's just that's not gonna work. We've been doing that for a while. 70% of them or whatever the statistics are still walked away. It didn't work. What they desire is really what we all desire. Surprise there, which is authenticity and a sense of belonging and the truth, of course.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I always, whenever I hear someone in your age demographic describe this, I want to learn that. That's a thing I think we can do as parents and educators and youth pastors. We have to be really good listeners because relationships are always two-directional. Mm-hmm. When I first planted my church, I wanted to plant a church that was relational like this. Mm-hmm. And so I knew that the number had to be really small. So I said, we're going to cap it at 50. If we get to 60, we're going to have to plant another church. Wow. And I don't need to be in charge of that second church. We need to find a leader to go plant another church. Right. And so we owned these cell groups. And this was a Southern Baptist church plant. We were planted out of the Southern Baptist Convention here in Southern mm-hmm. California. But we kept it at 50. And then after a while of doing this, I realized, man, the way I'm setting this room up is affecting the relationship because it was set up the way most teaching environments are set up. One podium, 50 chairs facing the one speaker. Mm-hmm. So I needed to break that down. So we finally developed a circular kind of room so we could all sit, and you wouldn't really know who was leading this group unless you knew who the leader was. Because I wanted it to feel like, hey, I want to hear your voices. I also knew I needed to change the way I was doing sermons. I'm not going to prepare a 45-minute sermon or a instruction. I mean, most of my stuff was always going to be case making. But I didn't prepare 45 minutes because I knew now if I'm going to really engage in relationships in that room, well, I need to prepare maybe a 10-minute launch because then I'm not sure where this is going to go because at some point someone's going to raise their hand and say, hey, yeah, what about this though? I mean, and that was free. You were free to do that in this circular setting. Yeah. You could raise your hand and ask a question, and I would respond to this question. And then before you know, now we're rabbit trailed. Yeah.
Is this at the I'm just curious now. Is this what you're describing now? Is that taking place at the time where you would see a traditional sermon. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So what we would do is instead of we when I started, I was fascinated by house churches, but I'm not one of these guys who says, oh, the only way to do it is a house church. The only way to do it is a mega church. No. Every form of church is beautiful and ugly. So I get that. So I just wanted to have truth and relationship. And the relationships, when I first started, though, I was just doing a big church idea in a small setting. I needed to break down the actual architecture of the room, the setting of the room, to facilitate these kinds of relationships. It also meant that I had to change the liturgy, the order of service, basically, to allow for relationship in the order of service. It meant that we would start at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we would go to dinner afterwards. And then we'd invade some restaurant with 50 deep, and we'd be there until 10 o'clock. So if we're going to pray, it's relationship prayers. That means we're saying, okay, now we're going to pray. We might be praying for an hour and 20 minutes because there's 50 people who want to pray about something. Right. And that's just the nature of this kind of group. And so this thing became really interesting. And when I started writing books, it meant that I had to step away from leadership of that group. But I will tell you, it's been hard to go back to any other form of community because of the way that group was structured, right? Here's my point. This is a generation, I think, like all of us, who wants to know, I think relationships are the outcome. So here's the second why. 2 whys for every what. First, why is it true? And then here you said authenticity. That's exactly right. The second why is, okay, great. You made a claim. You substantiated it evidentially. Why should I care?
Yeah. Even if it is true.
Even if it is true. Well, how does it impact me? I mean, it sounds like blah, 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 blah. Everyone's got blah, 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 blah. Just go on social media. Yeah. Everyone's got something they claim is true. Why should I embrace this, especially when it's going to ask me to sacrifice something in my own autonomy? You want me to be a slave to Christ? Really? I mean, why would I want to do that to begin with? Yeah. I think we have a duty now with this generation, 2 whys for everyone. Now, let me tell you how that would change your conversations. If you're a parent, it means that, you're going to still say the whats. I'm looking for opportunities to have what conversations, but I never present a what without the 2 whys. It might just mean I have to kind of think in my head. Now, listen, that means a little more work for me. Because if it's a claim that's maybe highly esoteric, it's theological claim about the nature of God, well, then I'm going to have to think about, why does that matter to anybody? Why does that matter to me? I think sometimes we stumble along in our Christian walk without being all that thoughtful about how it impacts us and how it has shaped us. Or maybe we were raised this way, so it's just part of our culture. We kind of embrace this life the same way we embrace being a resident of a certain community. Well, okay, we need to stop now and think about what are our whys? What are our 2 whys? And then we can't pass those on to anybody unless we know what they are for ourselves. So that's, I think, a part of what it's going to require us.
Well, let's say you present the case to me, and the what of Christianity, and then you present the first why, that is why it's actually true, and so you substantiate the claims, and then so what would your answer be for the second why?
Okay, so it depends on the claim, right? So if we're saying, well, okay, what's the deity of Christ? I mean, what does that? And I've thought about these. People have been asking me this question, and so one I now commonly will use with people is this idea that okay, if we said that God is triune, that's a pretty radical claim. I get a lot of pushback, believe it or not, when I post articles online. I do this on several platforms. I'm surprised at the number of people who will argue about the deity of Christ, who are in Christian churches, have self-identified as Christians, yet they think more like they consider it almost like a Jehovah's Witness version of Jesus as the first order being created by God, but they don't see Jesus as divine, and they do not accept the Trinity. That's something they just don't accept. Wow. I'm always surprised by that, right? I just thought that if you were a Christian, you kind of thought that. Yeah. But it's true. Now, people deny this, and young people are hearing these kinds of things. So why does it matter? First of all, how do I make a case for the Trinity when the Trinity, that word is not even anywhere in Scripture? And you'll hear this all the time. If they're going to fact check this and they're going to search, they're going to get a list of responses, and those responses, for the most part, are going to be anti-Trinitarian responses before they're going to be Trinitarian responses. So we need to be able to make that case, and even that case from Scripture, a case for the deity of Christ from Scripture. There's little things that are out there in the language of Jesus that give away the fact that he considered himself to be God, even from the smallest ways that he would address crowds. Never would he ever say, "The Lord Almighty says," "The Lord your God says."
Mm-hmm.
He never did that. He said, "I say to you."
Yeah, well,
truly, truly, I say to you.
You have heard.
It's clear from his language.
Yeah, yeah. One of my favorites that, as you said, it's never going to be explicit. I am God, but I mean there was actually a reason for that. The text actually provides a reason for that. He was waiting until his hour came before revealing these things. But the Sermon on the Mount is an interesting way to point to the deity of Christ, where he says repeatedly the structure is. You have heard it said to you, and then he quotes God's word, and then he says, "But I say to you," as if he's somehow on par or even more on par with God. Like, he's committing blasphemy, or he is God. So
no, absolutely. And so those kinds of things will help us make a case. But then the question becomes, okay, well, why does that matter?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the triune nature of God is huge in terms of our own identity, in terms of who we see ourselves. If we are created in the image of God, then don't be surprised that you have this strong desire to see how many likes you got on your Instagram. Why? Because you care about community. You care about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
You care about where you stand in the community of relationships you have. Well, why is that? Because you will never get away from that. That's part of who you are. You are created in the image of a triune being.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be seeking those. Now, but what's interesting about God's Trinity, God's triune being, is that these are all folks you can trust, okay?
Right.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, you can trust those folks, okay? You have to be careful who you associate with in your community, that they are equally driven like you are about the things that matter the most.
Right.
You don't have to worry about the Trinity being, well, there's one of these guys that's kind of an oddball you shouldn't hang out with. No, you might have oddball you shouldn't in your group.
Yeah.
So it's important for us to see how this esoteric theological position trickles down into our own daily lives, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think it does. These things do matter to young people, only because there's so much spiritual noise
mm-hmm.
that you've got to figure out what do I trust? Who do I trust? Sadly, Sean and I started taking these trips with young people up to Berkeley a number of years ago. I started with a gentleman named Brett Kunkel, who is just fabulous. He's got a ministry called Maven Truth. So if you've never thought about an immersive experience that will change the life of your kids, he actually has a design right now so that you can take your own trip without any help. He has all the tools there to train you on his website, teaches you how to take these trips. It's awesome. MavenTruth.com. A free plug for Brett.
Yeah.
But I started with him 15 years ago taking these trips. And we designed a trip to Berkeley. And we got up to Berkeley and we started talking to atheists who were in the area of the Bay Area, atheist professors, atheist student groups. There was a number of those on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And what we discovered is that there's a relationship between your commitment to spiritual things and your relationship with your own parents. We discover a lot of people who walk away from the church have broken relationships with their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts an onus on us. Not to say that's the whole reason why people walk away, and because if you ask them, they would say, "No, I've got good, rational, intellectual reasons for leaving." But don't forget, truth is connected to relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this is, well, who is the relationship with whom I'm getting my information?
Right.
And so I think it's important for us to recognize that parallel. And that's by the way, if you've got a son or a daughter who right now is not walking with God and is really not interested in God, and you keep on trying to present truth. I have folks in my family same way. I could tell the truth. It seems like it's going nowhere. It seems like it's bouncing off like Teflon. Well, okay, it's truth in relationship. So if there's a season in which I cannot speak truth to them, I can still work on the relationship side.
For sure, yeah, exactly.
And then at some point I'll have a strong enough, because it's together.
That's definitely a very important point. That okay, I have skeptic and atheist friends, and so. They kind of think my beliefs are silly, whatever, but they know I'm a really good friend. They really like me. I really like them. And I'm just going to do that because I actually love them and enjoy their company. But like you just said, a side effect or something of that, if you will, is that they're more likely to listen to me. We have conversations all the time about the gospel and about God.
That's right.
And it's because I actually care about them. They actually care about me. So yeah, the relationship part is definitely true. You were touching on parents, and so I have a question just about the title of the book. So the next generation will know. Does that come from Deuteronomy 6 by chance, or this is probably found throughout the Bible, but
it is found throughout the Bible. So the version I'm using is NASB. I like the NASB. People ask me all the time, what version of the scriptures do you like the best? And I could get into these debates about what form of scripture is most trustworthy. I love the word for word translations rather than the meaning for meaning translations. So I pulled it out of Psalm 78. Here's what it says. He establishes a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them.
Good.
The children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. So we had a name, I think, when we first started, but I don't know, I think I was just reading, and we do a nightly reading, so I think I found it in Psalms, and that captured it.
Same, different text than what I was going to turn to, but it makes the exact same point, I think. And I don't have mine up in front of me. I think if I switch the screen here, I don't know how that'll affect the video.
Right, yeah, here
but I'm thinking of Deuteronomy 6, and this was whenever I was a children and youth pastor, and the pastor was so brave as to let me preach on a Sunday. I would often go to Deuteronomy 6 and preach about the next generation, which seems counterintuitive, but turn into Deuteronomy 6. But this is where you find, I think you'll find the exact same words that the psalmist was saying there, and specifically that this was the role of the parents to pass on the truths of God, teach them about these things. And so yeah,
let me just say something about that. That's I love that Deuteronomy 6 passage, and you're right. I could have pulled it from there too. And sometimes you can't find exactly that language if you're not in the right translation.
Yeah.
But
I read from the NASB as well, so that's probably why.
Yeah. What I think is interesting about that is that I think as parents we do pass on passions about certain things. Mm-hmm. And I always use this analogies because I spend way too much time watching sports. And my wife's like, really? I mean, why are you so? I mean, it can be a little bit distracting, but I think the sports are kind of an analogy for living the Christian life. Often, you can see a lot about character, a lot about the role of sacrifice. Anyway, I don't really have in Southern California. There's not really a huge fan base for anything. It seems like, right? There's so many other distractions. But I know people who are huge fans of their region. And tonight, the Warriors are playing the Rockets. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're getting into the playoffs. And I know there are people who live in Houston who have passed on their passion for the Rockets just organically to their kids. They know that they talk about it. They watch it. They set aside time to watch the game tonight. It could be the Cowboys. It could be the Patriots, whoever your team is, the Oakland Raiders, whatever. But you've passed on your passion and interest in that. It could be fishing. And they know that because you start to wear it in your clothing. You carve time for it and set it aside. And you're excited about it. When you say, we got to go to the game last night. We got to go. Mm-hmm. How great. You get to go to a game. When's the last time your kids felt that way, or you even expressed it that way about your time with God? I get to go before the Lord.
Right.
You should pray more. It's like a duty.
Yeah.
Like brushing your teeth. You should brush your teeth more. Really?
Probably should.
I mean, it's pretty clear to our kids what we're passionate about.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this, I think sometimes parents think, I got to carve a whole nother set of time and effort to do this other thing. No, you just got to reprioritize the things you're already passionate about and you spend time with. It's time to reprioritize those things.
And kids these days in sports, that was probably a perfect illustration. You definitely do pass things on to your kids. And the parents really are the real children's ministers, the real youth ministers. They might get an hour with a youth pastor or a children's pastor a week, and they're going to get 8 hours a day with their teachers.
That's right.
And then everything else is going to be with you. So, I'll give an illustration for you. You might like. You gave sports. My dad was a huge Joe Kinda fan. Is that a name familiar to a fellow detective?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So,
yes. Well, there's always contemporary characters and detectives that people are fascinated by. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So we grew up either watching the Texas Rangers, the Dallas Cowboys, and so that was definitely passed on to me, or Joe Kinda, or the ID channel. My dad's a huge
my gosh, that's so popular right now. Yeah.
So my stepmom and I used to joke that he was watching that because he was taking notes and learning how he was going to get away with it, but.
I know, right? Yeah, we always say that, and never. But you're right, though. We have preoccupations with certain things that we pass on to our kids. So what we're trying to do is write a book that has so many practical illustrations in it of how you can pass on to the next generation. That when one comes up in your own life, you'll go, oh, this is exactly what they were talking about. Because I think what happens is we have all kinds of organic opportunities to share truth with our families and with our youth pastorate, whatever, and they kind of pass us by. Like we think that in order to pass on the next generation, well, that means we're going to set aside an hour a week on Sunday night. We're going to do a Bible study. No, okay. Look, what we're trying to do is show you how in every minute, in every situation you're in, wherever the context is, you can turn that into a teachable moment and have these kinds of. By the way, this happens organically for a lot of other things. If you're one of those sports fans, you'll find a way to talk about it 3 times today.
Yeah.
You'll find a way. You'll hear something on the radio. You'll talk about, did you realize, Dak Prescott, is he going to get that contract? It's a big contract. Should he get that contract? Mm-hmm. Well, Russell Wilson just signed a contract for this amount. I mean, how do I have all that information cluttered in my head? Well, I happen to be interested. And so if you talk to me for very long, if you're in a car with me for very long, the conversation will probably at some point roll around to those things I'm interested in. So now it's an opportunity for us as parents to say, okay, if I'm interested enough to know what I know well enough to explain it, well, then I can just look for organic. I always use this illustration. Before I became a Christian, and I was a Christian about 35, I became a Christian. And before that, if something happened that was like remarkable in my life, I would go, wow, what a great coincidence. Or I attribute it to physics, or I attribute it to chance. Stuff happens, good and bad, to everybody. I never thought of it as like, God's somehow behind this.
Right.
And even when I became a Christian for several years, I would still walk by that stuff. It took a concerted effort for me to start to see God's work in my life. And then suddenly I was seeing it a lot. I realized, oh, wow, that really is best explained by God's work in my life. I became sensitive to God's activity. First of all, I knew from Scripture kind of how God acts now. So I would look for it in my own life. Well, what we're trying to do with parents here in this book, and all these people who work with kids, is just to make you sensitive now to the opportunities you used to walk by. Mm-hmm. So you go, oh yeah, this is a great opportunity just to say a few things. And we don't, and by the way, we have train wrecked every suggestion in this book billions of times. We are not necessarily good at this ourselves. Okay? So pressure's off. Because I feel like I've missed so many opportunities. And so I think sometimes wisdom can come, almost always wisdom comes quicker from failures than it does from successes.
For sure.
So it doesn't have to be your failure. It could be our failures that you can just read about and say, okay, I get it. Yeah. And a lot of times we'll think, oh, this thing on the radio right now is a great launching point for this conversation I want to have. And then you'll try it and you'll go, oh my gosh, and your kids see right through it and they're like, this is a train wreck. So we just step off that and forgive me, move on, But I think it's important for us to make the effort, mm-hmm. especially if we do care about the future of Christianity in America.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Detective Wallace, thanks so much for coming on. If you're still listening with us, thanks for joining us. You can stick around for the 5 more minute bonus segment with Detective J. Warner Wallace. Spoiler alert, we're going to discuss some detective stuff. Couldn't help myself. But before we get to that, Detective Wallace, what would you say, and just in some closing remarks, to a parent or a youth pastor or a Christian educator who maybe they've been joining us through this whole conversation and they're thinking, you know what, all this sounds good. These are some good ideas. I want to start changing maybe my approach to this. What would you say just in some closing remarks to them?
Well, I think it could be overwhelming. And I was hesitant to write a book like this, number one, because I didn't want to position myself as an authority in parenting, because I've got my peaks and valleys in my season of parenting like everybody else. But I also wanted to produce something that you could just take one idea, one nugget, and move forward. So what I would suggest to anybody is like starting a diet or starting a workout routine. You don't hop in and start benching at your max. You hop in and you work towards something, but you do hop in. So what I would say is, at least now, I would just encourage you, especially if you see that your kids are starting to drift and now you're suddenly sensitive, I need to do something. Don't be overwhelmed. It's just, it's one step at a time. What's amazing is that I think God honors the first step and then opens up other opportunities for us. Also, I was 35 before I became a Christian. If you'd have asked my friends when I was 34, well, Wallace at work, would Wallace think he'll ever be a Christian? I guarantee there wasn't a police officer or a detective who knew me who would say, oh, yeah. No, they would have all said, well, probably not, because they knew me. Yet, here I am today. And that's why I have become patient, even with my own kids in that spectrum of where your kids may be. You might have 4 or 5 kids or 3 kids, and you might have a spectrum of belief. Be patient. Mm-hmm. When you think it's lost and there's no way that one will ever turn back, you'll be surprised what God can do. Mm-hmm. So just wanted to encourage people that just to know small steps. You might find one thing here that'll change the way you parent, the way you teach, the way you lead. That's all you're going to get out of it. That would be worth the time, I think, to jump in.
For sure. Well, be sure to get a copy of the book. I'll leave a link in the description here for you to follow and get a copy, leave a review. And Detective Wallace, thanks so much for joining me again. And,
absolutely.
There was no disappointment. It's just as great as the first time. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review. If you want to watch the bonus segment, 5 more minutes with J. Warner Wallace, and listen to some detective stuff, be sure to follow the link in the description below and become a supporter of our ministry. Thanks so much for joining us, guys, and we'll see you next time.